Thank you. I want you to think back to your first day on your job. Think back to whatever job you're in right now, the very first day that you were there. You had a conversation, I'm sure, with your manager, your boss, whoever they were. They came and they sat you down, and what did they say to you? They said probably something to the effect of, if you want to be successful in this job, here are the kinds of things you need to do. They might have said even something like the following. When I was in your shoes, the things that I did to be successful were A, B, and C. And if you also do A, B, and C, you too could possibly be successful in this job. Did anyone have a conversation, something like that? That's how the world kind of worked, right? Like that to some extent was the way the world worked. And that was okay. That's perfectly okay. And that's what we all wanted to do, because every individual in this room, every individual at a job, their main goal is to be successful. Nobody wants to go out and fail. Despite the fact that we love to celebrate failure these days, something we'll talk about later, that we'd love to eradicate. Everybody individually on their job wants to succeed in some way or some form. And that was fine when the world was moving relatively slowly, when the world was evolving at a less rapid pace than what we're seeing today. You could plan for a long career. You could do the things that your manager passed down to you. And when you made that safe call, right, when you came time to decision time and you made a safe call, you thought about what would your manager do, and you executed the same thing that they would have done, and it didn't turn out perfectly well, you had time. You had time in order that would allow you to adjust course. And that was okay, and the world just went on, and everybody was okay. The challenge is that no longer seems to be the case, right? With the kind of disruptive technologies that Harsh talked about, that the videos have been talking about, the reason you're here, we're seeing those kinds of moves be disrupted in the marketplace all the time, the kinds of traditional moves. And what we see here is that disruption is not necessarily a technology issue. Certainly technology plays a part of it, but it's actually the human reaction to technology where disruption doesn't play favorites, right? So what's going on in the world that we see, and why did we write the book Detonate? Which is the human response is they would like to please their boss. They would like to say, yes, boss, I did the same thing that you did. I did, see how smart I am. See, I should succeed. See, we should be promoted. But unfortunately, those playbooks, they don't work as well anymore because technology is obfuscating business models right and left. What is it that technology is doing? It's making possible business models that are an order of magnitude better or an order of magnitude cheaper. So consider the custom tailor business, right? Something I know that is reasonably popular here in India. I happen to have the curse of having this arm be about 3/8 of an inch longer than this arm. So things don't look right on me if I don't get them custom made. So I go to a custom tailor and I only have one choice, right? Which is I can get clothes on either off the rack or custom tailor, right? But it's not a very good customer experience to go to a tailor. Why? You have to go, they rub their hands all over your body, then they send the cloth away to be made. It takes weeks. It comes back. It's not perfectly fitted. They rub your hands all over your body again, and then they send it away, and then they come back, and you repeat 2 or 3 or 4 times until it's perfect. And then when it's perfect, it's great, but it took a lot of work to get there. Now, with disruptive technologies, I can take my phone out of my pocket, and my phone can measure me. 20% more accurate than a master tailor, right? And if they use robotics to make the clothes fit better and are cheaper. So what does the tailor try to do in response to this disruption? They offer coffee and tea while I wait. Right? And the problem is, sucking a little bit less is not a very good response to disruptive technologies. But yet that's our response. That creates this vicious cycle that we see here. And this is why we wanted to think about the human side of disruption, which is, interestingly, in the face of disruptive technologies, people's responses is not to question the playbooks themselves, but to question whether we applied the playbooks correctly. So what happens in a world where we put a strategy out into the marketplace that doesn't work? The boss gets called in and says, you must not have applied the playbook correctly. Let me check your work. Let me audit what it is that you did. Make sure that you applied the playbook exactly how it was meant to be applied. And so we spend more time studying things. We spend more time looking over our work. And then we put it back out into the marketplace, the same playbook, refreshed. And then it fails again. And then the boss's boss comes in and says, you guys must not have applied it right. Let's look at it again. And you continue to do that. You continue to do it until we go down the vicious cycle here. And as we like to say in the U.S., you become Blockbuster, right? Because you're defining a problem in a very narrow solution. In fact, we see this over and over and over again in the U.S. This is the response, and globally, in fact, this is the response that managers have to disruption, right? They feel like they're just applying the playbooks of the past, and that's one of the things that we see is the challenge in fact itself, is applying the lessons of the past is unlikely to yield the insights that are required for the future. And so what I want to spend time talking to you about tonight is, what do we do instead? What is the alternative to applying these lessons from the past? And it starts with spotting orthodoxy and challenging best practices. Why is challenging best practices an important idea? Well, let's just think about best practices for a moment. Let's just think about it for a brief moment and ask ourselves, what is a best practice? Well, it's something that is shared amongst lots of companies that they all do, that is supposedly a good way to work. Well, if my third grade math teacher was right, if I add up, if everybody is doing roughly the same thing, then by definition a best practice is not a best practice, it's an average practice. And the last time I checked, being average at anything wasn't a path to success in the marketplace. Being average was actually a path to failure in a disruptive world. And so we've got to look for different things. And so the things that we would encourage you to look for in your organizations are spotting orthodoxies, or what we like to talk about as conventional wisdom. These are the things that you would hear in your organization that your managers would say, we've always done it that way, right? If you ever get an answer to a question of why do we do it, and the answer is because we've always done it that way, then you know you've got an orthodoxy at work. A good example, right? We're in a massively successful hotel chain. Why is it that hotels don't let you check in before 12 or 1 or 2 or 3 o'clock when you come in off a flight, you're tired and all you want to do is get into your hotel room. You have to wait until the checkout time. Couldn't it be an orthodoxy to challenge that you check in when you check in instead of having to book your hotel the night before in order to have it here? Or we see it all the time in the grocery store business, right? What do we do in the grocery store business? We have the express checkout lane. The express checkout lane is designed for the people who have fewer than 10 items to get through quicker, right? So what they're doing is they're rewarding their worst customers with the fastest service, right? But that's just something that is pervasive across every grocery store chain that you see. Instead of taking the mom who's doing a weekly shop with 3 kids hanging off the cart and got a basket full of very expensive stuff and saying, we're going to give you our best customer concierge service. You can spot those kinds of orthodoxies all the time in businesses. And they're the kinds of things that entrepreneurs and startups see naturally. They see a conventional wisdom, they see an orthodoxy that large-scaled organizations have, and they say, you know what? I could do something a little bit different, and customers would love it. Customers would love it. I was excited to see that Raj Berry was on the agenda of Uber afterwards. Raj and I worked together in Monitor, New York, about 10 years ago, and that's a great example of challenging conventional wisdom. Was what Uber originally did, of course, right? Say, why should I have to stand on a street corner in the rain looking for a cab that doesn't exist when I can hail one on my phone? And that's the playbook. That's the idea of blowing up conventional wisdom that you need to have in order to survive. In a disruptive world. And so it would be inauthentic of me to come to Delhi and say we need to blow up playbooks and offer a set of new playbooks instead. And what I don't want to give you is a pat answer that says this is the new way of working, as if the new way of working will be future-proof. What I do want to impart on you tonight are 4 principles that we share in the book that are the critical principles to thinking differently and acting differently that we think all executives, all leaders need to be applying based on the specific situation that they find themselves in their business. So what are those 4 principles? It starts with thinking differently, and this is the most basic element of human business, is focusing on human behavior. The human behavior of your customers and the human behavior of your people. Why is human behavior so critical? What is it about human behavior in a world where technology is changing? Because at the end of the day, the only way that you grow revenue is by getting a customer to behave differently. Whether it's by getting them to pay more for something they're already buying, to switch away from a competitor, to enter a category that doesn't exist. The only way you grow is by getting a customer to change their behavior. So by identifying what behavior you want to change and by identifying what it will drive that behavior, what will drive that behavior is the most critical element of growth in this digital world. And importantly, when it comes to changing your own organizations for the executives in the room, the only way that you can get people to adopt new technologies, to adopt and to disrupt yourselves is by changing their own personal motivations. So instead of telling them that to be successful in the organization, you need to behave consistent with me, start giving messages that says, I expect you to behave different than I did. Start sending messages that you need to do different things. And that focus on human behavior and understanding that is the critical element to driving change in the world. The second element of thinking differently is bringing a beginner's mind. Okay? Why a beginner's mind? It's a concept from the world of Zen Buddhism. And in Suzuki's book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, I think he says really well, in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. And in the expert's mind, there are few. Has anyone ever noticed that disruption rarely happens from within an industry? Right? You rarely get disrupted by a long-standing competitor. Why? Because we all look at the world and we see the same challenge. In order to see something differently, in order to see the opportunities that might exist, you need to be bringing different thinking. My good friend Chip Berg, who went and ran Levi Strauss a few years ago from the Procter & Gamble company, the folks at Levi Strauss were appalled at the fact that their board had somehow hired a person from outside of the apparel business. There were whispers in the hallway, he doesn't know anything about apparel. And one of the first questions Chip asked when he got there was, help me understand, why does it take us 18 months to get a pair of jeans made in China, shipped back to the United States, where we sell them at a lower price than what we could sell them for in China? That was one of the questions Chip asked. In the beginner's mind, you see things that have never existed before, and you see possibilities, right? And so it's absolutely critical if you want to be the cause of change if you want to be the cause of change in your industry, you need to be infusing that long-standing perspective with beginner's perspective. This is where diversity matters a lot. This is where diversity matters a lot in making organizations successful. You've got to be infusing your talent base with people from outside your industry who just think about problems differently and have a natural empathy for what will cause the change in your organization. That's thinking differently. Acting differently is taking that concept from design, the minimal viable product, and expanding it to all you do. So if those of you that have been through the design thinking workshop for today have thought about the importance of understanding humans and understanding what they need and then making a minimally viable product, think about this from an executive perspective. Every choice you make is like a minimally viable, could be like a minimally viable product. Instead of making a big, bold choice all the time and risking the organization, what you ought to do is figure out a way to test that decision in a small way. Let me give you a very specific example. About 20 years ago, I was the head of strategy at Forbes magazine group. And Forbes at the time was thinking about launching a supporting product to our magazine called the QCat. Does anyone, I know the media industry is thriving here. Anybody remember the QCat or know what the QCat is? It was a device that allowed the reader to scan a barcode, and then that device would be plugged into your computer, and it would take you to a website dedicated for that advertisement. This was in the world before you were able to have short URLs that were easily navigated to. And this QCat was going to transform the advertising business. It was going to allow for greater engagement, which was going to allow for higher prices. And, of course, this was a good thing to test. This was a good thing that we should try, because if it did work as promised, then it could revolutionize the business. So what did we do at Forbes? We said we're going to corner the market on QCats. And we bought, mailed, and sent 1 million QCats to our entire reader base. What was the problem with that? Well, as it turned out, readers didn't always want to read their Forbes magazine while they were tethered to their desktop computer. We are still living in a wired world there, my friends. And the QCat was a device that you had to plug into your computer, which meant you sat at your desk and read your Forbes magazine. As it turns out, surprisingly, people like to read their Forbes magazine, say, on an airplane, or in the car, or on the subway, or in a doctor's office, or many places besides their desk. Now, it wasn't a stupid idea to invest in learning about the QCat. What was a dumb idea was to send it to 1 million people when we could have gotten the same learning by sending it to 30. Right? And so what we think organizations need to be better at these days is designing minimally viable moves in order to get the learning about what's going to drive that human behavior and what's going to drive the change in your organizations without necessarily putting the company at risk. Then the last way that's important to act differently is to embrace impermanence. Many of you are familiar with the media business. One of the things that I observed in serving the Procter & Gamble company for many years was, and they observed it too, was that the world was slow to, generally speaking, slow to adopt digital forms of advertisement. Right? We relied heavily, especially in the United States, but all around the world, heavily on television, even though we saw users, spending more time with digital media. Why was that? Because for a long, long time, there was someone in the organization whose job it was to buy TV. And what were they going to do? They were going to protect their job at all costs by promoting the relevancy of the thing that they did. The challenge with many career paths, with many organizational models, is that they're well past their sell-by dates. And what they do is they motivate people to try to protect their jobs rather than try to figure out a way to serve the customer better. And so for organizations to thrive in the future, we have to embrace the possibility that what we're doing today may only work for a little while. And then when it doesn't work anymore, when it's no longer relevant, we've got to be willing to blow that up. We've got to be willing to blow that up and do something different. But organizations get that entrenched mindset. So you've got to embrace the idea of being impermanent. One of the concepts we suggest in the book is a relatively periodic refresh of your organization design so that silos don't set in, right? And having honest conversations about career paths with your people, right? What do we do when you join a company? The first question you get from a person is, where will I be in 10 or 15 years if I stay here? I mean, goodness knows we can't even know what our industry is going to look like in 5 or 10 years, let alone what your role within this large organization is going to be. But we trick ourselves by trying to have those conversations. So rather, we think we need to embrace the fact that things might be impermanent. Things might need to become impermanent. So those are the 4 principles that we think need to be built better. In our book, we talk about the 7 deadly playbooks. I'm not going to go through each in a lot of detail. But these are practices that we see as pervasive across organizations that almost every company does, whatever industry, whatever geography. These are just the ways of thinking, and I'll share a few of these. And we were lucky enough to have a great illustrator in the book, a gentleman by the name of Tom Fishburne, who is globally recognized from his work as marketunist, and he saved thousands of words throughout the book and enabled it to be a quicker read for you. This is one where one of the challenges that we want to share is the way that we almost all organizations think about financial forecasting. Think about what we do. We say, what's the industry growing at over the next 5 years? And then what will our share of that industry be over the next 5 years? It's always going up, by the way. It's never going down. What will our share of that industry be? And then the next question, how much money would we like to make, right? If that's the revenue, how much money would we like to make? And then the worst question of all, how much can we afford to spend in order to generate that revenue, right? How much can we afford to spend in order to generate the revenue? What's the problem with that? The problem with that is that the world literally works in the opposite way. You spend money to generate revenue. You spend money to change that customer behavior, and that generates revenue. And just because you've existed in the past doesn't give you the right to exist in the future. And if there's one mindset shift that I might impart on you, it's always assume that you need to earn every dollar of revenue each and every year. If you believe that you've somehow got an inalienable right to revenue, then that's making you even more susceptible to disruption. Another orthodoxy we need to challenge is we need to adopt new learning in the fields of cognitive psychology, neuroscience, and behavioral economics. We love, in fact, I'd say we're addicted to asking consumers what they think. Right? We are addicted. We want to say, hey, let me show you this great new product. Would you buy it? Right? And then the consumer says, yeah, that's a pretty cool product. I might buy it. It turns out they're unknowingly lying to us. They don't mean to lie to us. They honestly believe what they say, but they don't know what their behavior will be when they're actually presented the product in the real world. And this is where adopting methods of design thinking is so critical. You can't actually find out in a very valid way whether or not a consumer will actually buy something in the real world unless you create a real-world condition for them to buy it. And the only way to create a real-world condition to buy it is to actually put it out in a small way in the marketplace. So to take an example from the world of Uber, when they first launched, they didn't ask consumers, would you like to ride in cars with strangers? Or would you be willing to buy this? Would you be willing to hail a ride from your app? They actually put it out in the market of San Francisco and saw what happened. Right? And they made sure that the experience that customers had there was similar to what they would get at scale. And they got a much better test. So stop asking consumers what they think. The last thing I want to talk about is this idea of celebrating failure. This is something that we see pretty pervasive in the marketplace today, where organizations love to celebrate the fact that they failed at something. They love to say, well, we failed, isn't that wonderful? And we think this is something that is just lazy management, right? Why are we celebrating failure? What is the root cause of it? Is because somehow we're embarrassed that things didn't turn out in the way that we expected. And that's not to say that I want everybody to go out there and not try to learn. We're actually big fans of going out and learning, but usually when we celebrate failure, it's because we lost more money than we needed to in order to generate that learning. It's that situation at Forbes. We celebrated the heck out of that success. Steve Forbes got up and said, it was great that we sent out a million QCats, and it was great that I couldn't contribute that money to my political campaign. And so we were celebrating that failure, and it was all over the place. But I think celebrating failure makes us lazy. Celebrating failure is an excuse to design poor tests. So instead of celebrating the failure, let's figure out that smaller test. Let's figure out that smaller test that allows us to get the same learning and then iterate faster and behave differently instead of figuring out a reason to celebrate the failure. I think that that's just causing us to be lazy. So what do we do? What would you as leaders do in the room? What's the one bit of advice that I would leave you with? And the place to start is about changing the questions you ask. So let's go back to where we started. Let's go back to where we started tonight, right? What do the people who are coming and presenting you with new ideas want to do? They want to be successful, right? They want to succeed. And what do we systematically do when someone comes in with a new idea? What do we ask? We ask, prove to me that that idea will work. How do you know for sure that that new idea is going to work, right? And what does the other person on the end do? They go back to their office and they pretty much make up numbers and they put them in a spreadsheet, right? And it's not that they're they're doing their best as they possibly can, but much like the consumer who wants to tell you what they do, that person is simply guessing at what the result of that new product is going to be in the world. So as a leader, instead of forcing that person to prove something that doesn't exist beyond a reasonable doubt, ask them better questions. Ask them questions that elicit things like, what's the behavior we want to change in the marketplace? Tell me what that behavior is. Tell me how we will disproportionately benefit if we change that behavior. How much do we have to spend in order to change that behavior? And how could we design a small test in order to know whether or not if we spent that money, we would get that behavior change? Instead of forcing them to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, in which case all that person will want to do is bring you the ideas that you can prove, bring you the ideas that are safer, and then you get trapped in that vicious cycle that I spoke about earlier. And so I think that if you apply those 4 principles of thinking differently and acting differently, you're not safe from disruption. But you're better equipped to deal with it. You're better equipped to realize that there is a real risk in doing the same thing over and over again. And by just learning to try some new things in the marketplace, it gives you a chance to adopt some practices that might work in the real world. And with that, I would be happy to take your questions. Thank you very much. Sir. Yes. Nice.
I'm Nishit Desai. I'm a lawyer, but a student here, Bain & Company talked a lot about founders' mentality. You must have heard about their talk, right? And you're talking about the founders, mentality to be given up. So I think the way, how do we interpret the situation that you follow? Or whether founders' mentality is very important because that has laid foundation stone, but the processes he followed and the way in which it was done, I think those things need to change while the value system comes from founder. So how do you reconcile imbibing the founders' conventional so-called wisdom in the sense of value system versus the actual operational thing?
I think you've got to, I think from a founder's perspective, you've got to be willing to abandon the things that don't necessarily apply. And I think successful companies who have evolved from founders, especially lots of family-owned businesses, particularly here in India, where I know there's lots of family-owned businesses. The thing that you want to impart is, what are the principles of operating that are generational? What are the things that should never change, because they're about ways of dealing with the customer? So in the U.S., and this is not a local example, but in the U.S. there's a company called Nordstrom that is family owned, and they've shown that they've been willing to adopt very new practices. They're even taking the company private. They're closing stores. They're looking at differentiating in the marketplace, but they're still adhering to the thing that they were invented to do, which was serve their customers well, right? And so they're finding a way to adopt those founders' principles to be relevant in the new world. I'd say where companies are rigid and they say, well, that's the only way we know how to work, those are the companies that you've got to be careful. And I'm not sure about the difference with focus there. I think you've always got to have, to some extent, a choice about what you do and what you don't do. I think of those as a little bit different than applying the founder's principle, because you could always apply those principles to new markets and adjacencies, which I think are critical too.
The founders often tend to invent or do something different, new, and that's how they grow. That is the most important thing. You have to constantly reinvent yourself.
Yes.
I think that's the way I would look at it.
And if I were founding a company today, I'd be very clear to what extent I thought the company needed to try to live forever. I think it's a notion in business that needs to be challenged. I'd say there are some companies that can try to live forever, but what needs to be true to be the case? You've got to be better and better at reinventing yourself. You've got, that's a capability. If you want to live forever as a corporation, as a company, as an entity, one of the core capabilities you need is the ability to reinvent yourself periodically when your business model becomes refreshed. That's a choice. And one of the things that we talk about is, what's the opposite of that? Could there be more space in the world for what we describe as pop-up companies, right? Why couldn't there be more companies that exist in the world to take advantage of an opportunity and then decide we're going to shut this down and pay our shareholders out when this opportunity is done and reinvest that capital somewhere else? And so I think the world will start to divide into these two types of companies, because it's really hard to reinvent yourself over and over again. There are very few companies who do that particularly well. Thank you for the question.
Hi, I'm Ashu. Thank you for the great session. My question is, there's a lot of effort going on big data, getting intelligence from data, understanding what's the customer's opinion and all that. And the other side is where, like you say, get a minimum viable product out. So how do you see these two working together? Because, data, there are a lot of companies and people saying that you can get a lot of intelligence from that data, which can actually reduce the cost that you do on building the product. So where do you see data fitting in your mind?
I'm really glad you asked that question, because this is one of my favorite topics. So I think we should be I think we are lazy in describing the value of big data, right? And I think we need to parse it into its different forms. So for me, the biggest value in big data, and let's define what that is. That is the exhaust that we get from our digital behavior, which tells a company that owns that data exactly what you did as a consumer, right? So think about it, the e-commerce world. What's so valuable, in a company like Amazon? Why is it so valuable? Because they know every product you search for. They know every product you bought. They know when you didn't buy something. They know what price you were willing to pay at it. They have your behavior. So writ large, what big data does is it fills in the gaps of our knowledge about what people actually do, right? Because what have we done as companies forever is we've tried to research what people do by sending surveys out and by using lots of relatively unreliable methods to understand behavior that now big data allows us to be more certain about what happened in the world. And what happened in the world allows us to have a much better knowledge base to test our hypotheses. So the second piece of it is it fills in the gaps of behavior. And then the second bit, it allows us to test hypotheses about to what extent, if we did something different, would behavior change, right? So if you go back to that focus on human behavior, having the data allows us to test those hypotheses about to what extent we can cause behavior. Where I think companies tend to go a little overboard is in an unwavering belief that big data will then tell us what people will do in the future. And if you simply believe, I think that there is some predictive value to the extent that we all raise our hands and take an oath and say the future will be exactly like what the past was, right? Because inherently all data that exists in some system today is about the past. And so if we believe that human beings will continue to do the same things as they did before, then big data will be predictive. And in some cases that might be the case, particularly in the short term. But over the long term, there will be disruptors who decide that I want to be the cause of behavior change. And so I think that there's a lot of value in understanding behavior, in testing hypotheses, and I think that there's some danger in predictive. You've got to be willing to say that my bet is that the world will continue to be as it is. Now that's not necessarily a bad hypothesis, but it's one that you have to be aware of and know that they could choose to do something. They could choose to do something different. Consumers often won't tell you when they're changing their behavior, right? Ask that custom tailor. Thank you. Great question. Yes, sir.
Hi, thanks for the session. Quite awesome. Would love to figure out if I can get a hand on that book.
We're figuring out the logistics.
Couldn't find it on Amazon right now. But my question is a little more operational. When we are talking about MVP versus business as usual, typically the folks that are working on MVP as a team and the folks that are working on business as usual are kind of at loggerheads.
Yes.
What's been your experience in terms of how that should be structured for a business leader, and if there is any advice on what is the amount of investment that needs to be made on MVP versus business as usual?
It's a great question, and what's funny when you, just as a side story, when you write a book with a co-author, you figure out that you're actually writing two books and merging them into two. So you guys got the strategy version of the story tonight. If my co-author Jeff was here, he talks a lot about the knowable and the unknowable space. And what we believe is that more and more opportunities are getting developed into the unknowable space, which require techniques like minimal viable product. And a few years ago, when Jeff wrote a Harvard Business Review article about the degree to which you needed to have different investment in your core, in adjacent, and transformational innovation. And we said at the time that it was about 70-20-10 was on average for all industries, and obviously it would depend to what extent your industry was refreshing itself. But we think that even notion is now out of date. That if you believe that disruptive technology is obfuscating business models right and left, then you've got to be investing even more in minimal viable products or transformational innovation because your core is at threat. I'm going to answer your question in a slightly different way, which is to say that we know that there is a concept in business which is take the folks who are working on transformational innovation and put them off to the side and don't let the organization touch that stuff because they'll wreck it. I think that that's absolutely right. I also think that we've got to disrupt that business as usual a little bit. And the thing that I think we need to disrupt the most is the idea that there is no risk in business as usual, right? What do we always do in business as usual meetings? We say, we could do the thing that we're doing today and we're safe. There's no risk in that. Or we could do this new risky thing and we don't know what it's going to do and that's really risky, so maybe we should continue to do the safe thing in business as usual. I think the thing that we need to change is that mentality, because I think there's a lot of risk in doing the same thing that you're doing today. And so we would say you need to be disrupting your business as usual in different ways than you disrupt how you do minimal viable products. You can put people off to the side and go and invent stuff, but you've got to be more thoughtful on how you reinvent business as usual, because that's generating your cash, and you can't just blow that. You can't just blow it up. We chose the word detonate for a reason, which is detonate is, a controlled blast. So we want you to be doing things that are in control, that are evolving how you do business as usual to bring them more into the current day. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Thank you. I think there's a question behind you.
That was a wonderful speech.
Thank you.
Quite a few insights in that. There was one section where you talked about those 7 practices.
Yes.
But you kind of glossed over it.
Sure.
Do you mind sharing a few more thoughts on that particular topic?
And if we want to pull the slide back up, I'm happy to run through them really quickly. So I know them. Actually, I know them pretty well. So risk management systems. This is the world of, anyone knows stage gate systems? Okay, so stage gate systems are where we take an idea, we put it in the thing, and we erect gates. We say, if you want to get to this level in the process, you need to meet these financial hurdles, and then if you want to get to this, we need to have the following tests met. Stage gate systems are perfectly good for ideas that are known, that we can go out into the world and ask a consumer, would you buy this, and they can reliably tell us whether they would or not. The problem is they are terrible for things that are unknowable, right? Because people make up the data, they don't know what they are, and so we think for risk management systems, for product launch systems, we need to be reinventing how we need to be blowing those systems up and turning it more into things that, I can click to it, turning it more into ideas that are just testable in the real world. So that's number one. The strategic planning calendar. This is where every November we get together and we say it's time to refresh our strategy because the Earth is at this particular location around the sun. Your strategy is only good until it isn't. Okay. Sorry, I'm having like dueling things with the thing. Your strategy is only good until it isn't. So rather than have some annual process to refresh your strategy, make some choices, and then ask yourself the question: what needs to be true for my strategy to continue to be successful? What are the things in the real world that I need to continue to see? And sometimes, that strategy might be good for a while, multiple years, 5 years, and some companies would even say they've had the same strategy throughout their existence, okay, or same basic choices, some of the founders' principles. Certainly we at Deloitte in our audit practice have had the same founding principles, the same core strategy in our audit business for a long time. Okay? We've refreshed other aspects of our strategy, of course. But if you start to see things that aren't true anymore that were foundational, that's the time to refresh your strategy. So let the outside world tell you when it's time to refresh your strategy, as opposed to the calendar tell you when it's time to refresh your strategy. The other thing I'd say is I want to eradicate the idea of this is a 5-year strategy or a 3-year strategy or a 1-year strategy. There is no way that we can sit here today and know how long our strategy is going to be good for, right? It's not a carton of milk. It doesn't come with an expiration date on it when you start. And what that does, it sort of puts you in rigid. It's only good until those choices are no longer good. I actually talked about financial forecasting, about the follies of the way we did it. I didn't talk about syndicated data. So this is where we use data from outside providers that sell their data to everyone, and we rely on that data to make strategy decisions, right? And what I see in many companies is that is the data that they need. I spent time with a chief strategy officer of a food company not too long ago, and he said to me, we've analyzed all the data from Nielsen. We know the most attractive categories are the following 5 categories, and therefore we're going to invest and serve those categories. What's wrong with that? His 4 biggest competitors have access to the same data, and they're going to draw the same conclusions from the same data, and those 5 categories are going to be way overserved, and the other categories that were unattractive are going to be underserved. And so you can't just rely on syndicated data. you shouldn't ignore it. I'm not saying ignore it, but having some proprietary data will allow you to have insights, and that's why the proverbial platform companies are so valuable, because they spit out proprietary data that they can make better decisions on. I talked about traditional insight generation with the person surveying and answering raw kale when they've got ice cream in their hands, and I talked about the last two, which were the idea of celebrating failure, instead make a minimally viable move, and the idea of organization charts and career paths leading to ossification inside organizations. So those are the, but that's the, hopefully that gets at the question you asked.
Yeah, thanks.
Shit. Yeah. They will yank us off stage. I'll take questions.
I'm
until
sorry,
they
because I hope all answers are free today, so I am taking maximum advantage. Thank you so much. Two things I found in my study of organizational behavior. One, the biggest menace that is going on in the world is about targets. Targets of the organizations have distorted the behavior of the organizations.
Like incentive targets, sales targets?
Sales targets.
Okay, sure.
Objective targets in particular are very susceptible to manipulations. Mm-hmm. As a result, for example, pharma companies, okay, you have to achieve target, you have a problem, and then you manipulate. So Johnson & Johnson has removed targets. Glaxo CEO was arrested in China because now we experimented that, and we said no targets. Targets come from within, not from external. Typically what happens every year, you sit with a person and 1 hour discuss what is your target. His potential is 100, he'll say, I'll do 60. And you negotiate to do 70, he does 75, he goes away great way. But you never talk about potential. So what we found, behavior we are talking about. So if you don't talk about target, but what is your potential, that's more motivational it comes out from. And our experience, it increased revenue, at least we saw that, almost by 29% by removing the target, because then people are more inspired to do that. Number two, I think new age policies. We are so stuck to the old HR or human resource policies. Netflix, Patty McCord, recently I think she wrote that book, Powerful.
Yes.
One of the finest books in recent times, sharing the experiences. I think that again changes a lot of. So I think I would like to learn from you a little bit about the new age employment policy, or whatever. I don't like to use the word employment any longer because nobody's employee. So if you can just give your reflection about the need for target, or can you handle it differently? And what do you think? We have to revisit the entire policy manuals that we have been writing and following for years together.
So in a word, yes, I think we do. So I agree with what you're saying. I think that if you go back to the very basic principle that I talk about is a focus on human behavior. And if we look within organizations, what's the number one driver of why people behave in the way that they do is because they are incented in some way by their sales targets, by whatever they're evaluated. Venkat and I were just having a conversation about, even at Deloitte, you can't make changes, you literally can't make changes to strategy unless you change the way that our people are evaluated and paid, right? And so I think you've got to start to experiment with different ways of motivating people, because in some organizations targets can be very helpful. They can focus behavior. They can create some degree of concreteness for people who need some degree of this is what you want from me. So there are a segment of the population who thrives from saying, tell me specifically what you want and I will go and do that. There's a different segment who thrives on not having that concreteness, about having the fluidity to explore. And so for your organization, whatever it may be, you have to figure out what are the set of incentives and targets that will motivate the kind of behavior that will allow you to serve your customers well. But I think some of the challenges that we've seen in the world are the fact that people oftentimes just try to will new behavior, right? They say, please go behave differently, and they don't give them a real reason to it, and then they're shocked when people don't change their behavior. So you absolutely have to change incentives, culture, target in order to get the behavior that you want. And I think with that, I think Harsh is going to One last question? Okay. Okay.
Oh, you've got.
The lady in the front. We're going to, so that other can have, here, I'll be the mic runner. There we go. There we go. Oh. Okay. All right. I'll just hold this.
Hi, I'm Devi.
Yes.
Now, we are talking about changing behavior. How do you incentivize human beings to change?
Yeah. You first have to understand what motivates them, right? And think about that manager in the room. Success means something different to everybody, okay? And it means something at different parts of your career. Some people get motivated by paying them more money. It's a relatively small percent of the population that is strictly motivated by money. Some people get motivated by moving quickly. Some people get motivated by solving tough problems. And the leadership challenge is to make sure that you've got the right set of incentives for the right people that you're trying to hire. And so if you're hiring a group of designers who are really jazzed about solving a new problem, then provide them those incentives in some way. If you're hiring really driven people who are going to be motivated by success, then figure out a different way. So I would say match the most basic principle will be to match the incentive to the thing that motivates that particular person. But that's the management trick. It's rarely this incentive always works and this incentive doesn't work. I think you've got to know the kind of people you've got in your organization.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The reason I asked is that I'm from the social sector.
Yes.
And in this sector, getting good people is always
right. And so in this, I'll give you an idea to try, and then I'm going to let Harsh yank me. An idea to try would be in the social sector. I think one of the challenges that almost always happens is that it's hard for the people who work in the social sector to specifically see the result of what they did. So people choose to work in the social sector frequently because they're motivated to make the world a better place. And so if you want to get more of that kind of behavior, make it easier to see the impact of what it is that you did on the world. And when you're working in an ivory tower where you're trying to do good, but you don't get to see the result of it, that can be demotivating. So figure out a way to make that result even more visible to the people that you see. That would be one idea.
Thank
Great.
you so much.
Aren't we glad, Venkat? Thank you so much for your time. Pleasure. Before we call our next speaker, I do believe he has a flight to catch, so I'll keep this brief. I did want to acknowledge that this is being streamed live on YouTube, and we do have a live audience. So welcome. If you do have any questions, please tweet #Converges28, and we'll be sure to keep those questions in mind. But without further ado, I will call upon Raj Berry to come speak with us. He is the regional GM for Uber Eats. Please, Raj, come in.
Thanks, everyone. There it is. All right, great. Thanks, everyone. Excited to be here, talk for the next 20 minutes about everyone's favorite topic, food. So, one of the things that, we spend a lot of time thinking about at Uber, and I've been at Uber for 3 years. Like Harsh said, I run the Uber Eats business across Asia Pacific now, is how as a company that, has disrupted a few things like Steve has talked about, do we still think about disruption? And so I'd love to spend the next few minutes talking about how we started thinking about that and growing the next disruptive business out of what was a disruptive business at Uber. When we started Uber, 9 years ago, we really didn't think about, hey, we're going to get into food delivery. We really thought, as our founders did, hey, I was in Paris, it was snowing, I want to get back to my hotel, I wish I could just push a button and get a ride, right? And that's how Uber, came into being. And since then, 10 billion trips later, do, 15 million trips a day, but, it was really just about that. Now, over the next few years, we started thinking about, okay, if we can just get you a ride in 5 minutes, what else can we get for customers in 5 minutes? And how should we then think about even experimenting with that? And so, for those of you who've used Uber Eats, whether here or other parts of the world, it didn't start in its current form. How it actually started was in LA, we said, okay, let's pack a bunch of vans and cars with pre-prepared food and drive it around. If it comes within 5 minutes of where someone is and they want a sandwich, then they hit this, and within 5 minutes we drop them off a sandwich. And so what we found from that test was that, hey, this is great. People actually were doing this, but we also found that they wanted more selection. They wanted more nuance. And so we went back and said, okay, this could be a thing. Let's think about how we build this out. And that's really where you saw the first instance, really actually about 3 years ago next week, of Uber Eats. And since then, it's really evolved overall, not only Uber Eats, but overall Uber. So, we started in just the rides business. Then we started getting into the food delivery business a little bit. We've recently launched scooters. We've launched bikes in the U.S. We've launched Uber Freight, which is B2B trucking. There's future-looking things like Uber Elevate, where, maybe you won't have to drive through Delhi traffic and you can get a plane to take you from A to B. So as we thought about all these things and spinning out how to launch them, our first real big hit outside of the ride-sharing business has been Uber Eats. And really, as Uber is in 600 cities in over 70 countries, Uber Eats has had even a much, more hyper-growth trajectory, if you can believe it, only being around for about 3 years. And then the next thing we thought about was, okay, if just like the rides business, if you were taking an Uber here in India or in the U.S., we wanted to make it more about not just your special occasions, hey, I'm going to the airport or but how can it be part of everyday behavior, right? So you think about it when you're going grocery shopping or to the movies or wherever. And that's really what the rides business has become in a part of the world, ride sharing in general, just replacing car ownership. So when we thought about Eats, and this was just a few years ago when I started, we said, okay, beyond just being pizza delivery for your Friday night when you're sitting at home with your family, it needs to be an everyday usage occasion. It needs to be around when you're traveling, when you're at work, when you're sitting in the park. So this has to be something that then brings this behavioral change into how people think about experiencing food. And that's really where our mission comes from. And it's really around, hey, very simple. How can we make eating well effortless at any time for anyone? And why I say that is it's a simple kind of sentence, but within that, there's a lot of complexities, both in terms of customer behavior as well as in terms of technology. For those of you who know Uber, it's a two-sided marketplace on the ride side. So you've got drivers and you've got riders, and you match them together, supply and demand. Now with Uber Eats, it's an example of a three-sided marketplace, right? So you're introducing the complexity of the restaurants in there as well. And so that idea of, hey, I push a button and then my food arrives in 30 minutes, it's a very complex technological problem. And what you really want to do is create it so that it's just as convenient, just as reliable, just as cost-effective, and you have just as selection as people have if they go to their restaurant, if they go pick up food, if they cook at home. And that's really what we're trying to solve with Uber Eats. And so in 3 years, just to give you a little bit of background, because we could leverage the rides business that we had to disrupt ourselves, we haven't had to follow the standard path of expansion or growth. In 3 years, we're now in over 400 cities in over 40 countries with Uber Eats. If you look at our most recent financials that were released a few weeks ago for Q3, we did over $2 billion in revenue with Uber Eats at a run rate of over $8 billion a year. And so as a business for us that was just under 3 years old, from that time when you were thinking about let's drive sandwiches around in some cars to see if people like this, to where it is now has really involved intentional ways that we think about structuring our business and intentional ways that we think about hypergrowth. Because what Uber Eats actually is for us at Uber is a hypergrowth business within another hypergrowth business. And so when we were thinking about, okay, this is a thing, how do we scale this? We had to also make sure from an organizational design perspective we didn't get in our own way. And what I mean by that is you have a lot of choices when you're trying to spin up a new business within a current construct. And what we did intentionally with Uber Eats is said that, okay, we're going to spin up separate operational teams. We're not going to embed this in the core business because it's at a different stage of maturity, and we're going to let these teams run with it. We are going to put in place people that are running all our markets that are separate than the rides business, and we are going to allow them the ability, even though we have millions and millions of data points from the rides business, to make decisions to scale with incomplete information. And we're going to be okay with that. And that's really the crux of kind of how we've designed this business, and that's kind of unshackled us from being able to scale at the pace that we're scaling. Now, of course, you leverage common technology infrastructure, you leverage common marketing, you have a common customer in many cases, and so the rides business definitely blazed the trail for us at Uber to do this. But that being said, it's also disrupting the business of food. And that's really what I want to talk about a little bit, is that we've really looked at it in terms of it's creating different ways that restaurants are now actually thinking about their businesses, right? So they're saying, okay, how do I actually leverage delivery to create new incremental revenue streams? How can I actually scale this other part of my business with no CapEx, with no OpEx, and basically just do this in an efficient way? How can I actually leverage data to tell me what menu items to do? Where should I think about expansion? And so what we're actually seeing is that, while we're disrupting ourselves, and we have to think about how to do that, we're understanding that we're disrupting food delivery. Right now, Uber Eats is the largest food delivery business in the world outside of China, right? And that's taken us 3 years to get there. And so as we look at what we want to do going forward, we have to think, hey, how can we continue to do that? Because, like Steve and others have mentioned, if we don't do it, someone else will. And that has to be in the DNA in how you look at things. It's also about what is our view of how the future of food consumption is changing, and what does that guide what we do? If I look at this, just 50 years ago, eating out was a very different experience. It was a special occasion. You'd go with your family to a restaurant, whether it was a birthday or something, and you'd make a big occasion out of it. When I was growing up in the 80s, it was just then in the U.S. and Canada where the concept of something called fast casual or quick service restaurants started to take off. And that was the idea that, hey, you didn't have to spend as much. It didn't have to be as much of an occasion. It could be convenient, and you could go out. And you saw a lot of these quick service chains start to sprout up all over the world. Now what's happening with the next generation, and a large part being driven by millennials, is that, hey, people don't necessarily think about it as, only going out to eat or only cooking at home. If you can provide the same reliability, convenience, and price point, people want the convenience to being able to say, hey, I want this food now, I want it wherever I am, and can we do that? And so what you're seeing now is that, hey, if you can marry those together with kind of an affordable concept, you're really shifting consumer behavior away from how they thought of food consumption in the past to how they think of food consumption now. And that's where we really believe it's heading. To give you a little bit of context of how that's playing out here in Asia and India, in this context of this being our biggest growth business at Uber, Asia Pacific is the fastest growing region for Uber Eats globally. It is our second biggest market outside of the U.S. India itself is our second biggest market in terms of the number of food orders that we do outside the U.S. as well. And we've just been in India for just over 18 months. And so the global scale at which this behavior is changing, you see here some numbers, but since January, the Uber Eats business has grown 4x. And it will continue on this path over the next year. But in India especially, and this is where we're seeing the most hyper growth in this overall space, not just in Uber Eats. So we've seen over like a 7x growth in our business here in India over the last 4 months. We're doing millions of deliveries a week here as well. And I think what's happening is you're seeing the convergence of both a great product market fit, but also the right timing for that. And as you look at Uber, we're always not the first to market. While we are in the U.S., let's say for ride sharing and things like that, in India, actually, when we entered here, we were entered after Ola, right? It's a place that we're very comfortable not always having to be the first mover in. But, after 5 years being here in India, and I spent my first 2 years at Uber helping run the India rides business, we're very comfortable that, hey, we have a template. We know that there's enough room for growth and that this is a market that you don't have to be the first mover in. For Uber Eats, we're actually the fourth mover. I like to call it, this is our fourth mover advantage here in India. It's a very crowded and competitive space, as you know. I think what's allowed us to scale so rapidly from basically zero to where we are now is a few things. First of all, there is a brand we have here. We're able to leverage that. The Uber brand is known in all the cities that we've launched in. We don't have to create that. The second is, we have been able to leverage our operational infrastructure. One of the things that we find is when we talk to other companies that are in this, they're like, hey, how can you expand so fast? The reality is we have operational teams in 700 cities around the world. So when we think of new businesses, as we think of disrupting ourselves, we don't have to go out and completely build things from scratch. We have teams, we have talent, we have opportunities for them to move to their next career move within the company. And this gives us a great advantage as we think to scale in a business. We also have, in this case, operations that are, know how to onboard drivers and things like that as well. And so as we're seeing this, what we're seeing is that, that's allowed us to scale fairly quickly here. We've only been here about a year and a half. Like I said, we've seen some hyper growth. We are now in 37 cities. We're actually in more cities with Uber Eats than we are with the rides business. And we have an average delivery time in India of under 35 minutes, which is, to me, fairly amazing, given traffic in a lot of our cities. So that was just a little bit of context. But where I wanted to kind of spend the most of this time on is, how do I see this disruption playing out in India overall in this industry? And what does that mean for how we think about, things at Uber as we build this out? And so I think where the future of food is going in India, and this is really about food, I think, is not just meal delivery. I think this is just a much bigger space here, is that this opportunity is really immense. And I think, like I said, it's because of a few factors. India has seen this market of food delivery grow to about $1.3 billion this year. It's going to grow 2.5x next year to be over $3.5 billion market in India next year, and a $5 billion market by 2020. So you're really entering at a time, too, where this market is being pulled forward by a bunch of players like us and the other incumbents really pulling forward behavioral change by, in many ways, incentivizing that behavioral change in the market. It's also a great product market fit. And why I say that is, if I look at the rides business in India, if you look at the top 7 cities, it was a great product market fit right off the bat. You look at Bangalore, Delhi, Mumbai, right away the concept of ride sharing just made sense. And that's why it took off. As you go into the smaller markets, the Tier 2 and Tier 3 markets, there was more of a behavioral change that you had to do there. The idea of taking a luxury AC taxi when you're in Indore or Vijayawada is not as something that is as friction-free and as something you can create that behavioral change right away as you can in the top 7 cities. What we're actually seeing with food delivery in India is that in Tier 2 and Tier 3 markets, the growth is explosive because you're not actually inducing as much of a behavioral change as we were with the rides business. People were already ordering food. They were already calling for food. They were already getting someone to go and pick up their food. What we're really introducing is a behavioral change on how people experience that with a technology platform. And so what we've actually seen is our fastest growing markets in India are actually Tier 2 and Tier 3 markets where our Uber Rides business maybe hasn't grown as much in the few years that they've been here. And so what you're seeing is that combined with kind of all the players innovating together is really pulling forward growth in this market. An example I like to give of this that I think India would be moving towards, maybe in 5 years is China. I was in China last month visiting with Meituan and Ellie Mae, who pioneered food delivery in China. So what they said is, 3 years ago, we had to create this market. And so we said, okay, how did you do this? We said we subsidized food delivery for 3 straight years in China. By then, people were so used to it, it was just as convenient. They saw it was just as good in terms of selection, and just as cost effective that when we started pulling back subsidies, the behavior was already there and the market was created, right? And so what you're actually seeing is similar patterns playing out here in India, where there is a lot of subsidies going into the market, but it is intentional because you're really creating some behavioral change in a value-conscious market where you want to demonstrate that these other things around reliability, quality, convenience, and price are there. And so I think where you'll see the world heading kind of in this space over the next few years is it's really key for users in this space to have as much choice as possible. Selection is key, so you have to work with all the brands, big brands, small brands, your local brands, everything, in order to actually drive adoption. The second thing is you're really revolutionizing the restaurant industry. And so you really need to think about how can we help them manage this disruption? How can we be partners to them as they think about, okay, now I'm creating businesses that are a lot based on delivery. How does that change my economics? How does that change how I should go to market? And then the third thing you're seeing is you will see big, huge advancements in how food is delivered. We are already starting drone pilot deliveries in San Diego with Uber Eats. And so you could see a world in a few years where that happens in India, especially with the new drone policy that we've worked very closely with the government on as well, that over time you could see that, hey, it doesn't take 30 minutes to get from here to here in Delhi in traffic. Maybe it takes 5 minutes if you're delivering that food. And that changes the value proposition for customers as well, is if you can push a button and your food gets there in under 10 minutes, you're really, really creating huge behavioral change and opportunity there as well. So what I think was going to happen and what we think is going to happen is that over the next 2 to 3 years in markets across the world and in India, these innovations, these disruptions are going to cause a behavioral change in how people experience food. So if we look at it now, if millennials, if the youth of today, if people working in offices are starting now to get more and more of their meals through food delivery, what used to be something that was maybe once a month, we're now seeing being a few times a week. Now as you create more opportunities for everyday value and everyday food, that becomes something that could be a much larger part of what they do. Now as that happens, it's going to create huge disruptions actually in how restaurants think about their business. If you think of you're a restaurant, and 5 years ago, most of your business was what we call front of house, people coming into your restaurant, dining there, and then going home. Now let's say 5-10% of your business is food delivery. Over time, as behavioral changes from consumers, you could see a world where 50% of a restaurant's business is coming from food delivery, right? Then if you look at the current economics of a restaurant, it is probably the least cost-effective way for restaurants to manage that business. High rent in big cities like Delhi, Tokyo, London, and 50% of your business, no one's even stepping foot in your store anymore. And so then we have to think about how we help restaurants innovate. And so what we're doing is we're seeing things like virtual restaurants. We're seeing things like dark kitchens. And what a dark kitchen is it's a delivery-only kitchen where you put a bunch of brands in. They pay no capex. They rent out a space. You create the kitchen for them, and they can use it just for delivery, right? And so you're seeing thousands of those spread up around the world, here in India as well. What we're seeing is thousands of virtual restaurants. What virtual restaurants are think of a brand that's selling, sandwiches or selling biryani, and they have unutilized kitchen space. And they're like, hey, I'd love to offer more to customers. What are customers in my neighborhood or where I am actually eating? And so what we're doing with our technology and our data is surfacing that to restaurants, helping them, through our marketing, create brands that do not exist in the physical world at all. They only exist virtually for delivery only. So that biryani maker could start selling pizza, could start selling desserts using that unutilized kitchen space and make that available for delivery. And that's creating incremental revenue, that's creating higher profit margins for restaurants, helping them think through how do I navigate this next phase of disruption in our space. The most prevalent example of this in India that we just launched a couple months ago was we launched an exclusive virtual restaurant partnership with Cafe Coffee Day. So Cafe Coffee Day is the biggest restaurant chain in India with over 1,700 locations in over 250 cities. And so we work with them to say, okay, you have 1,700 kitchens all across India. They're not as utilized. You want to be more in delivery. How can we help you create brands online that can also give great value to customers who aren't getting certain types of food on delivery and seeing cuisine gaps? So we just launched something called Home Cravings in Bangalore, and it will be expanding throughout India in 2019, where we've said, okay, these are meal replacements, kind of a meal in a box. So think of a biryani meal or another type of meal that can be for a family or an individual. And they're only available through Uber Eats and Cafe Coffee Day through virtual restaurants. So there's no way you can go into the store and buy this. This is just for delivery because there's a gap there that we found from the data, and demand was showing that this was something that the market really wanted. And so you'll see more and more of these innovations happening over time. And what that's going to do as consumer behavior changes and as restaurants adapt their businesses, you're going to see the whole space of food consumption change. So in those dark kitchens where they're preparing foods for meal delivery, maybe there's one floor that's for groceries. Maybe there's one floor that's for other goods that you could deliver as well. And so as a bunch of things start to be able to be delivered, you start to realize the value of the platform. And that's really how we think about things at Uber, is that, hey, we're a logistics and transportation platform. We've had a couple of hits with rides and eats, but there are many other things that this platform can build, especially if you look at the value chain and the supply chain of food, right? So there's meals, there's also dine-in and pick-up, there's grocery delivery, there's convenience stores, there's just a bunch of things that you could do, but you could see a world in the future where all of this is operated out of a centralized kitchen. And as more and more of the consumer behavior is shifting here, we're helping restaurants and other partners try to navigate this. And like I said, this is going to drive behavioral change in how food is delivered. At some point in the future, it will be too long for food. If I press this button and that food's not at my door within 5 to 7 minutes. And so things that may seem futuristic right now are things that we have to spend time thinking about, right? So that's why we're thinking about drone delivery. That's why we're thinking about Uber Elevate, is because over time, these will become bigger parts of the value chain of logistics and supply chains, and it's important to have bets in these conversations. And so while, it seems like the food delivery space is growing here a lot, and it is, I still believe we're in like the first innings of this space. Overall, this space is going to grow massively over the next few years. And as part of that, it's important, like as we think about as we're intentionally designing not only our business at Uber, but as we're designing our org and our talent plans at Uber, is that we're constantly laying the seeds for these new innovations, and at the same time providing opportunities to leverage the common platform and infrastructure we have. I actually think the biggest thing that we've done is actually make sure that we're not hamstringing our organization when we launch these type of things. I think we could have gone one way of like, let's fold everything into one broad business, have it run by the same people, and fold everything in. I think we could have done that. It may have been more efficient to start with, but it would not have allowed us to scale this quickly to this growth. Now, over time, yes, those organizations and structures can come together, but I think, we're just big believers that you have to, within an organization, give room for these things to grow. You have to be able to make choices that are quick with incomplete but pretty detailed information and put people in positions where they can do that. I think one of the things we're finding globally and here in India as well is because of this, though, too, it also leads to a great way that you can design talent programs in a way that people can navigate their career at an organization in different ways. Because, let's say, someone's done the Uber Rides business in India for 3 years and you don't want them to churn and leave. Then you have a whole new shiny thing that they can work on and lead, right? And as you spread that up, it's just important to make sure that not only from the external standpoint are we actually, innovating on the business standpoint, but really important from an internal org perspective that we continue to innovate so that we can allow the best talent, the best teams to take these on instead of having to kind of start these businesses and hire talent from scratch. The reason we've been able to do this in India is because a large portion of the team that led the Eats launches in India came from a rides business, and they had been there for 3 to 4 years looking at their next adventure. When we launch the next thing, we expect the same thing to happen. So it's really important to be fine that we're cannibalizing our own talent and to make sure that they have kind of great opportunities to go forward. So with that, happy to take any questions, whether it's on food delivery, the future of food, or how we think about kind of creating the foundations to do this disruption at Uber. Thanks.
Sure. Yep. Any questions? Yep. Once again, no, absolutely.
One question, I think, to you and, Stephen. What is the role of behavioral economists? They get Nobel Prize in behavioral scientists, and do you really use them in the corporate setting? Because somebody gets Nobel Prize. In India, I do not think we use this kind of expertise much. And do you use that, or is there some role they can play in the whole setting that you're talking about? Because the whole discussion is on behavior.
Yeah, so I think you use it in a few different ways. I think, one of the things is, because we are a three-sided kind of marketplace, certain things that you would do in, let's say, a non-marketplace model in terms of getting pricing levers or even pushing some of the thinking on, how do you create behavioral change just from demand levers, are things that we can do, but we have to also understand that there's other sides of our marketplace that come into play. So, for example, I couldn't go and offer free food to everybody in India, even though it seems like we're probably doing that right now in terms of the food industry, because of what we have to consider in terms of all the economics of the other players. So we deeply look at that data. We deeply believe that there's different levers in different markets. Like, for example, the way that we're scaling the business here in India is very different than the way we're scaling the business in Japan or Australia, which are our two biggest other markets in Asia. Right? Here it's a very, value-conscious market, less loyalty to brands, or even, I would say, quality of experience that anything that subsidies cannot overcome. I'll give you an example of that. Because in another market like Australia, the most important thing is for me to have 98% reliability, so that only 2% of orders are not delivered or less than that. Anything below that, customers will churn. They'll say it's unacceptable that I only got 98 of my 100 orders and not everything else. And as you think about investing in other things like subsidies and wherever, if your supply and your courier driver base can't support that reliability factor, you're really just churning users, you're churning customers, because that's of utmost importance. In India, it's fine if you get 9 out of 10 orders delivered, because people are like, hey, 9 out of 10, that's great, and it was really, really cheap, right? And so as we're thinking about behavioral economics of our regular customers here, we realize that they value price and value over reliability, and in many cases over selection. And so as we make certain choices in kind of how we change behavior, you kind of have to adapt that in markets. Like, I wouldn't be able to go into an Australia or Japan and just subsidize the heck out of it and expect to continue to grow the business if I wasn't able to back that up with reliability. While in some markets you can sacrifice a little bit on reliability as long as you're providing these other factors there as well. Yeah, I think we got a couple in the back.
Hi, my name is Amit, and I'll be honest, I haven't used Uber Eats yet. My question is, it sounds like it's just another food delivery service. So how exactly are you adding any value?
Got it. Yeah, so I think there's a few things to look at. One is, if in a market like, I'll take India for example. In a market like India, what we're seeing right now in the food delivery space is 3, 4 players really all investing heavily in the market, seemingly kind of offering similar selection, similar services, etc. Now, I think over time you get to a world where everybody has the same selection. So all the same restaurants are on every platform. If I'm a restaurant, there's really no value for me in the long run for not being on all these players. So I think over time the differentiation does come in the reliability and the core foundational elements as well. So what we've seen in other markets, playing this ahead a couple of years, is that when you take subsidies out of the market, what remains is your core foundational principles. Hey, does that food get there in a really good time? Is it high quality? Is it reliable? And can I get it wherever I want, whenever I want? Now, I think doing that when you have 100,000 orders a week and doing that when you have 10 million orders a week is different things. So I do think what you'll see, not just for us, I'm saying what you'll see overall is differentiation is going to happen in foundational elements related to can you actually operate this business at a scale of hundreds of millions of orders a week and be able to do that reliably, cost-effectively, and at scale. Because the players that will survive will provide that differentiated value. The other value, I think two of the things we're touching upon is the way the future is heading, and this is where we believe, is that you'll be able to open up your food delivery app, and right away before you do anything, we will know what you want to eat. And we will know that today you went to the gym, and today you're on a diet or you're not eating gluten, and that this is based on the other things that you order, or you have a family of 3 and it's a Tuesday, and Tuesday is the day that you don't have, or Sunday is the day you don't have help at home and you need this type of food. And so I think what we're seeing now is that the technology to get really, really differentiated in terms of relevance to eaters, so that you're actually cutting through the clutter of their selection choices, is something that creates differentiation. But I think one of the bigger things is around the restaurant side. Ultimately, this has to be of value to restaurants. And so what we're seeing is that the technology and the innovation in how you help restaurants grow, delivery is just one part of it. Delivery is, hey, yes, it's the most cost-effective and reliable way, but really what we're seeing over time is you're a partner to the food industry to help them think about, hey, where should I place my next restaurant? As I think about this, how should I think about menu pricing? How should I think about expansion? How should I think about other brands to offer? So what you're seeing through things like virtual restaurants and dark kitchens is that first foray into that. So I definitely think technology will be a differentiator. The ability to personalize will be a differentiator. But I think the foundational metrics of reliability, convenience, and choice are going to be actually differentiating in this space. And why I say that is we're seeing it playing out in other markets already is once subsidies go out of a market, the players that are really standing there are the ones that have that.
Hi, Raj, I'm Praful. No take cue from the last sentence that you spoke about technology. How does Uber and Uber Eats in general look at technology from a scalability and also a reusability standpoint, not just across businesses, but also across geographies, given that each of us will have their own nuances, and how that would affect things like speed to market, innovation, all of that?
So I think, one of the things, and I've, worked 20 years at different companies, just my last 3 years here at Uber, is definitely, from a technology and an infrastructure perspective, and the ability, once we have signal, to say all systems go and be in, hundreds of cities and markets within a month, I think that's probably one of our core strengths. And we do have a common technology infrastructure and a platform. Obviously, you built on top of that when you launch Eats. You build on top of that when you launch Uber Freight, and you add different nuances to it. But those are very scalable globally, and so it allows us to deploy in different markets very, very quickly. Now, but to your point is, India, for example, we've had to create different experiences that would not be relevant in the U.S., right? So we do have local, so it's all about, think globally but build locally. That's kind of how we do it. So, for example, on the ride side, you would have seen there's a product called Uber Lite, and that's because, hey, there's not great connectivity in all cities in India. You need to operate on no network connectivity or 2G networks even. And the Uber app is pretty big, right? And so that doesn't work in all our markets. So we created Uber Lite for markets like India, for markets like LATAM, for parts of Africa, where we know that we need to operate this in a low connectivity operating environments. And so that's where you see the layer of building kind of specific nuances for markets there as well. The other nuance on the eat side is, in India, it's very important to filter veg and non-veg and have that be very, very clear that this, hey, is not only veg, but hey, it was not cooked near this, it was doing that. So that was something that was created specifically for India. The other thing is the Indian consumer wants to shop for offers and deals. Hardly in any other place in the world do we have a toggle that says, okay, here's all your food, but here's all the deals, right? And so those are examples of when we go into markets understanding, hey, this is not going to work in the one-size-fits-all approach. What do we need to layer on top of that? And therefore on our technology platform to do that.
Well, one last.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you so much, first of all, for drawing the parallel between the present vision and the future vision of Uber Eats. Now, my question comes from a millennial perspective and someone who orders food almost 2 times a day, from all the online sources. Now, see, you've been constantly saying that the market here in India and the market in Australia and Japan are completely different. Because obviously in India, you want to shop for the right kind of coupons and the right kind of fancy promo codes. But what I think, and from a perspective, is that who doesn't love applying that particular promo code or that particular discount if they have the knowledge for it? Obviously, I won't go and waste 5 minutes of my time shopping for the right discounts. But if it is coming in my inbox or if it's coming in my messages, I would surely love to apply it. And that's the first part of question. Second part of question, which is very important, is that when will a point come when the acquisition cost of a customer will plateau down and will break even with the revenue per customer? Will it ever happen in the markets globally, or will the model of cash burn be the winning model for the coming years to come?
Yeah. So I think, I'll answer the second part first. So, with Uber Eats, we actually, and, we publicized this early in the year, we hit profitability in about a third of our markets globally earlier this year. What we found, though, was there was really this was a growing market, food delivery. It's still very, very early days. And so we said, you know what? There's no reason to pull the profitability lever as quickly, right? And so we're really in a period of what we think is super, super early days of growth of this. So you're actually kind of doing yourself a disservice if you're actually trying to get profitable too quick. So we made a conscious decision, earlier this year to say, you know what, we're going to invest for growth and do that. Now, to the part of the question is, when you have a platform like Uber and you have a rides business and you have an eats business and then ultimately you have whatever other businesses you layer on top of that, that's really where you see the customer acquisition costs come way, way down over time. If you look at how this played out in other markets where there's this concept of a super app, like in China, really what it does is actually lower your customer acquisition costs, right? We have hundreds of millions of people. We have about over 100 million people that have signed up for Uber in India, right? Therefore, when we launch Eats, we have 100 million people that we've acquired as customers, right? And so you see the economies of kind of efficient customer acquisition coming as you start to do a platform play across your markets, especially in markets like India, LATAM, and other markets we see in Asia, where there is also propensity from a consumer standpoint to say, I want to have one app for a bunch of different things. That's not true everywhere. And so to your first question is, yes, we definitely see discounts and subsidies being a big thing everywhere, but I will say that it's not as much of, from what the data shows us, in some markets it's more of a deciding factor on where people are going to order food from. And in other markets, it's a complementary factor, right? And so basis where you end up on that spectrum, therefore you see different things. Now, the other thing is when you have all different players coming into a market because they realize that, hey, this is going to triple in size next year and double in size the year after, you end up in a little bit of an irrational market, right? And so you either have a couple of choices. You exit that irrational market, or you say, you know what, we believe that this is a market that you're pulling forward behavioral change and growth in, and over time the unit economics make sense, and you're willing to play that game, right? And so as we make intentional choices across the world, we know that India is such a huge hyper-growth market, not only for food delivery, but overall as you think about all the different things that Uber could do. And so we're intentionally participating in that market as we look to pull forward growth. Great.
A generous round of applause for Raj. Thank you so much, Raj. Before you go, if I could request Venkat to share a token of appreciation.
Thanks, Venkat. Thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, thank you very much. Yeah.
Great. Please come on stage. Go. Thank you.
I'm going to say just a few words at the front end, and we're going to invite a couple of panelists up. But you can see the topic of our discussion. We're going to talk about customer-centric innovation in a world of emerging technologies, and what a perfect lead-in from Raj's comments and Steve's front end as well. And I know you're going to really appreciate hearing from our panelists. They're going to talk about how they see this from their perspective. I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes teeing this up with some work Deloitte's recently done in a global survey focused on new emerging technologies around Industry 4.0. We released a survey quite recently, and we'd be happy to give you links to it, where we went out globally and sought feedback from the C-suite on how they were seeing the new world of emerging technologies in Industry 4.0. We got feedback from over 350 senior executives across primarily industrial industries, across a number of key geographies of large global companies. We asked for a variety of things, and we focused on really 5 states of play. And we've written this report because we found some very interesting paradoxes. And by a paradox, I mean the survey results said one thing, yet some other aspects of what we learned said another thing. And when you read this report, it's really quite an easy read. We've gotten a lot of really positive feedback on this. There really were 4 areas that we focused on. Some things we found in how companies approach strategy in their business around these emerging technologies. We found some very interesting, and remember we were focusing in this survey largely on companies that make things. So not surprisingly, we asked some questions about their supply chains. We found some interesting paradoxes in what they told us about their supply chains. We found some interesting paradoxes in how they thought about innovation, a really important thing I know to many of you companies here in India. And lastly, a major focus on talent. Again, not surprisingly, we'd ask about talent because that's a really key aspect of how companies are embracing these technologies. And lastly, we tied it together with a broader focus because at the heart of an Industry 4.0 is a loop from physical to digital to physical. So that's the essence of what our survey was all about. And maybe to get to the punchline so we can more quickly bring our participants up here, really 4 key findings. One, we really learned that digital transformation is not just about technology. When you heard Raj talk about some of the fascinating technology innovations that come with Uber Eats, a lot of this is around changing consumer behavior, really changing the whole paradigm about how people eat. It's way more than about technology. We've also found when we surveyed our participants, there's a lot of paths to digital transformation. And we'd really a suggestion that companies think about this very strategically. And again, when you think about both Steve's comments and Raj's comments, there's a lot of focus on strategy here. I think that was backed up by some of the survey results we learned when we recently surveyed these C-suite participants. Also a major focus on talent. And when you think about the emerging technologies, think about all the talent that is driving what's happening at Uber globally. Think about the kind of talent that it will take to compete in the new world that Steve is talking about. As we surveyed, again, these are companies that make things. They're embracing new technologies that are changing their businesses, and maybe more importantly, changing their business models. There's a real question about whether you have the talent that's needed to drive those things, where that talent's going to come from. And again, I hope as we tee up some of these introductory comments, as you listen to our panelists answer a few questions that I'll pose them, hopefully some of these things will come through. And lastly, as we thought about what's really important, we really got a strong consensus from the C-suite we talked about the importance that this phenomenon be driven all the way through the organization. That it's really important for people to be heard both at the customer side, at the supply chain side, and all through the organization. And again, if you haven't glanced at our study, please have a look at it. I think you'll find it to be really quite informative. Maybe with those opening comments, I'd like to welcome up our two panelists. If you could bring the chairs up, please. And I want to invite Andrew and Prabhat, if you could come on up, please. Just please have a seat at the stage and let me properly introduce you. Perfect, thanks. Have a seat, wherever you like. First, to my immediate left, I'd like to introduce Andrew Cohen. Really thrilled to have Andrew here. He's come quite a long way. And he serves as the Chief Executive of the Manchester Airport, which is part of the Manchester Airports Group. And he's been in this role since September of 2017. He's been in the organization since 2013, has had a variety of very interesting roles, and as we got a chance to get introduced earlier, has a variety of things he's trying to accomplish here in India this week. So Andrew, welcome. Thrilled that you're with us, and would love to hear your comments about how you think about the consumer and innovations in your part of the business. To Andrew's left, we have Prabhat Agarwal, who is the finance director for OLX India. And what I'm going to do, and let me tell you a bit about OLX India, and Prabhat has been in his role just since January, but has had a variety of other roles leading up to this. OLX, you may not have heard much about OLX, but they're an online marketplace, headquartered in the Netherlands, owned by the well-known investment firm Naspers. And so we thought having these two come up, again, talk about how they see the customer will lead to a really interesting set of conversations. So I'm going to pose a few questions to them, but I also want to save a little bit of time on the back end for questions you've had. You've really served as an audience to really be asking very insightful questions, so I want to make sure to save a fair amount of time for that. And maybe as I ask you the first question, maybe as you're doing that, and Andrew, I'll turn to you first, maybe just say a little bit more than my brief introduction about your organization. The chance we had to get caught up earlier today, it sounds fascinating. And so maybe just say a few words of introduction to how you see the company and your role and how you think about the customers, and I'll pose a question to you, and then we'll turn to you and we'll go a little bit of back and forth, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks very much. Good evening, everybody. Manchester Airport Group is a UK airport group. We own 3 airports. We've got the 3rd and 4th largest airports in the UK, and we've also got the largest pure freight airport in the UK. We have about 60 million passengers a year come through our airports, and what's really interesting for me is listening to Stephen and Raj and listening to how that fits with our business, because I think what's really interesting is the fact that you might look at airports as being fairly traditional infrastructure businesses, and to a large extent they are. But that's changing, and here's the reason why. And it's a lot of what we've been talking about just now. I think if you look at, there's no doubt that the digital revolution is here, and it's hitting all of us. And if we look at the space traditionally that we operate in as an airport, we provide infrastructure, which is airport terminals, car parks, runways, etc. And we used to have passengers who used to come to the airport and they'd spend 2 hours at the airport, they'd turn up, they'd get on the flight and they'd go. What we're trying to do now is reimagine that and think about that end-to-end passenger journey. And the digital revolution is making a huge impact on that. So if you think about when people start to think about booking a flight, it could be 12 months before, it could be 6 months before, it could be 3 months before. If you think about how they schedule their time, if you think about how they plan, if you think about how they then communicate with other people, if you think about how they navigate, if you think about how they then make purchases, these things are all done digitally now in our world. So what we're trying to do is think as a business about how can we capture the value from that. Two major indicators for airports in terms of value that we create for our shareholders. First one is about penetration, and that's about how many people are actually spending with us. And the more people we can penetrate, the better that is for us. The second one is average transaction value. So the people we are penetrating, how much are they actually spending in our facilities? And what we're trying to do is use the digital enablers to help us actually do that. And we've created our own business. I know, Stephen, you said that not many businesses disrupt themselves. We're actually doing that. And we've actually created a division within our business that is called MAG-O, and that stands for MAG Online. And what we're trying to do is create products and services that is very different from what's already out there. And how can we then connect with those passengers at pre-journey and post-journey? And that's starting to bear some success for us. So we are thinking about the world very, very differently. So that just kind of gives you a bit of a context about our business and what we're trying to do.
Perfect. Perfect lead, and I'm going to come back to you shortly with a follow-up question. But on to you, Prabhat. Maybe tell us a little bit about your business, maybe how you're seeing things from a customer lens. Obviously, two very diverse points of view here. So tell us a little bit about how you're seeing things from the OLX standpoint.
Thanks, Tim. Good evening, everyone. Just to introduce OLX, and I'm sure a lot of people in India have used OLX in some point in their life. We currently operate classified marketplaces in about 45 countries under different brand names. It might be Avito in Russia or Letgo in the US, OLX across a variety of markets. And I think across the last decade, the group has been sort of leading from the front in setting up classified marketplaces across different geographies, different models. And, being part of, hearing the discussion earlier from everyone, I think a lot of it resonates with us as well because, so we are essentially trying to make the journey from classified marketplaces to newer business lines, and we've done exactly what has come up in the panel. There's a separate ventures unit that we've set up that experiments across geographies with different business lines, and then sort of takes those experiments to fruition across various countries. So we've done a fair share of different business lines in India around facilitating transactions for cars, for jobs. Eastern Europe's businesses are essentially experimenting with delivery. And all that is happening with these MVPs that we've spoken about, and they've worked very well for us.
So thanks. Great opening comments. So I want to dive just a little bit deeper, Andrew, and start with you. As you look across airports all around the world, they seem to be deploying more modern technologies to attempt to drive value, both for passengers as well as for airlines. You know, as you think about what does creating value look like for you in your venue, just say a little bit more about that.
I think one of the things that's very interesting about airports, and particularly in the UK, if you take the airport that I run, there's 300 different businesses work there. That's 80 different airlines. We've got 80 different retailers. We've got in-flight operators. We've got regulatory bodies. We've got car park operators. I mean, it goes on and on and on. So if you think about that from the lens of a passenger, it's quite a challenging landscape that they are trying to navigate. And part of what we're trying to do is say, how can we join all those customer touch points together to get a better product for the customer, but also using that data to extract value for the reasons that I said earlier. So I think what we're trying to do is declutter that kind of that process of people coming through our facilities, and we're also trying to extend, as I said earlier, that process to pre and post journey, and we're trying to create that lasting relationship and create that relationship that's going to endure, so that when we do capture data, we can then use that data. And just in the same way that Raj was saying earlier, once we know people's behaviours, we can use that information in the future next time they visit us. So if somebody parks in a certain parking space and they like a certain type of product, which is proximate to one of our terminals, we know we can incentivise them to use that same product next time, and we can perhaps try and squeeze some more value out of it. So there's lots of different things we're trying to do through the products and services that we're offering, but also we're trying to get more information. We're trying to use that information to incentivise and to generate loyalty, and they're the sort of things that we're looking to do.
Perfect. Thank you. So, Prabhat, on to you. It seems like from everything I've read, OLX is really changing the trend of online classifieds. You've got a campaign in the English version of it, effectively, is Everything Sells, that ensures that a product that's on your site turns very, very quickly. How do you provide value in terms of the customer? Say a little bit more about that, maybe talk a bit more about this campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. So this campaign came out in 2011 and 2012. And I just want to go back into conventional classified wisdom and typically what we've seen in Western markets, essentially how classifieds grow. And it's been about building two-sided network effects between buyers and sellers. And typically we've seen companies like Shipstead, eBay essentially grow that way in the West. And for us, in the early part of our journey in India, essentially breaking the stigma of selling second-hand goods or buying second-hand goods was paramount as we started that. And that campaign essentially was aimed in that direction. As we've gone on, and pretty early on in our journey, we also realized that in emerging markets, there are other problems also that need to be solved. And while we were actively trying to solve these, what we also realized that trust and safety, again, is a very big problem in our country. And there's a lot of work that we do to solve for this. There are dedicated helplines. There's a lot of consumer education that we do. And again, we work with different consumer segments. And some of the consumer segments that we work with now essentially are under-penetrated when it comes to the internet. And what we do is essentially we first start with posting ads on their behalf. And slowly there's a program of educating them to become self-enabled. And those are some initiatives that we've run to sort of educate our customers, get them up the curve, make the digital transformation possible.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. So, Andrew, I want to come back to you and maybe just go one level deeper. Yeah. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the technologies. How do you employ these technologies to really effectively engage the customer and kind of draw them in? Tell us maybe one level deeper as to how you're actually doing this with customer engagement.
Well, I think it's very much about putting yourself in the shoes of the customer and the passenger in our world, and thinking about how can you make their life easier, and how can you create a product that they're prepared to pay something for. So one example that we've rolled out recently, we've introduced a product called Grab, which basically anywhere in our terminals you can go onto our app and you can order food and it will be delivered to wherever you're sat. So if you were sat in here and you were in an airport, you go onto our app, and that, in the same way as Uber Eats would deliver, the food outlets within our terminals will deliver it to wherever you are. And I suppose the next evolution of that is to build on that, and it would be knowing people's preferences, it would be knowing how frequently people come, it would be knowing what their spend profile is, but also it would be that you could pre-order. So if you're coming through security and you wanted to order goods, or you wanted to order services, or you wanted to order food or beverages, you could do that whilst you've got some downtime, and when you get there, it's there ready waiting for you. So these are the kinds of products that we're trying to develop. In terms of the actual platforms, I'm heartened to hear about the minimum viable product, because that is exactly how we do it. We build it small, we trial it, we see if it works, we see what the customer feedback is. If it works, we scale it up, and that's how we go about it. It sounds simple, but we don't celebrate failure. We definitely don't do that, because we try not to have any of these that fail. We try and create products that people want. So that's really how we go about it. I think to your point about how do we imagine these things, a lot of it comes from the type of people that we've brought into our business. So you look at me, I look quite corporate in a suit and a tie. The type of people we've got in our Mag-O business, they come to work in jeans and T-shirts and training shoes. They are a different kind of mindset to the people like me who've worked in the infrastructure industry for many years. And they are able more easily to put themselves in the shoes of the people that we're trying to sell to. And they're the future of our business. So that's the kind of way that we go about it.
Well, I know one thing. I spend, like many of you perhaps, I spend about 3 days a week in airports. I've never really found an app quite like this before, so I might have to find some clients in Manchester. Maybe come back to you, Prabhat. The combination of expertise and experience. How does OLX look at your workforce to provide this combination to your customers?
I think part of it comes from the way we typically recruit, and one of our core values is putting customer first, customer centricity, and all the roles typically that the way we define that are working back from the customer. Essentially, the skill set that we lay out should essentially go out and solve problems for the customer, and I think that has been the cornerstone of our recruitment policy and retention policy. So that goes a long way. Now, again, a few examples. We take diversity in our hiring very seriously, and the way we think about this is that internally our workforce should represent the consumers that we are trying to serve outside, and if that's a fair representation inside, we feel that that is necessary to essentially solve or create products that people love on the outside. So that typically goes a long way. I think there are a lot of talks that are going on currently on how to leverage the gig economy very well. And essentially by that I mean there are sometimes roles that come up with require very niche skills. And it makes a lot of sense for us to get in people who are very experienced for short stints and then learn how to work with them very well. So that's something that we hope will work very well for us. Another thing, I think there are no national boundaries typically in the company, and the core principle has always been let the best people attack the most relevant problem, and it cuts across national boundaries. It gets people very excited. It gives them newer problems to solve, and I think that has helped. That goes a long way.
Yeah, thanks, Prabhat. And again, just having listened to these first few questions, you can tell these are two very innovative companies with a real focus on the customer and the consumer. But let me then ask you both a similar question. On this journey, I'll start with you, Andrew. There must have been challenges, right, to really turn your organization. And you wouldn't necessarily think that an airport company would be very consumer-centric. At least many of the airports I travel to don't seem to be that way. So you've obviously had to do really a bit of a transformation in your business thinking. And you've had to have some challenges along the way, and obviously you found some ways to overcome those challenges. So maybe say a bit about some of the challenges and some of the steps that your organization has taken to effectively get to a customer-oriented mindset.
Yeah, I think there's probably two key areas for us. One goes back to what I said about the complexity of running an airport and the number of stakeholders who are actually involved in that. And one of the things that we've also done, we've created another app which is about airport information. So in any particular day, airports are quite dynamic environments, things happen. How you share and propagate that information with all the key people who need to know is a real challenge. And if you get that bit wrong, then things can go badly wrong fairly quickly. And I think we live in a society now where social media is absolutely dynamic. It's in the moment. Things propagate very, very quickly. And I think the second point I would make is absolutely around that. Because traditionally people would write in and complain if they had a problem. They might write in and give us positive feedback if they had a great experience. Now it's on social media and it's in the wider media within a matter of seconds, right, even sometimes before we know about it. So that's one of the key challenges. The environment we're operating in is such a dynamic environment, and we have to be able to respond to that and be alive to that. But we'd use that to develop our business and to reconfigure our processes and to support. That feedback is very insightful. So customer insight is really valuable and very, very powerful for how we continue to develop our business.
Again, thank you. And this does sound like an airport I've never been to before. So
you're welcome to try it.
So on to you, and obviously as you've built up this fascinating business, you've obviously had to overcome some challenges. Maybe talk a little bit about some of those challenges and steps you've taken in your business to really become a very customer-centric structure.
Actually, that's part of an ongoing discussion in our company that always happens as to how we can push the envelope there. It's a constant conversation. I think one of the things that we've done well, and at least what I believe has really worked, is we've set the tone at the top very well there. And I'll share a few examples. So whenever a leadership, somebody in the leadership, say from global, comes to India, or when we travel, we are encouraged to go out and meet our customers, and that's something that's something that we take very seriously. So even when our, say, global CEO is in India, his first stop will be at a car dealer's place or at a real estate agent's shop, rather than maybe come straight to the office. And that tone setting becomes very important. Also, there are KPIs built around customer centricity. Our tech teams, and especially our product teams, but also other functions, are encouraged to go and spend days at customer helplines. And I think the management and each team leader leads from the front, and that has worked very well for us. That's a culture we've been able to drive very hard, and it's really taken us a long way on our journey.
Terrific. So, I've got several more questions, but I know we've got a very inquisitive audience, and we've got two organizations and two leaders here that are coming from very consumer-centric structures. And so why don't we open it up to questions that you might have, maybe go a level deeper than I've done. So please raise your hand, and we'll get a microphone to you if you've got a question. Yes, please. We'll get a microphone to you. Thank you.
Yes, hi. I'm Vineet. I have a question to you, sir, for your airport app. So, you built this app for airport information or for the food that you said. The question, what I am intrigued about is, how do you get that app to the user's device? What steps are you taking for that? I just wanted to hear your point of view there.
Yeah, and it's a really good question. And one of the challenges that you have is how you capture those consumers in the first place. And it goes back to what I said about loyalty. Typically, our passengers will travel multiple journeys per year. We have some passengers who come through 2 or 3 times a week. And what we try and do through the loyalty programs that we've got and through some of the information the content that we push to people. So things like if you come through our airport and you want to use our Wi-Fi, you then go through a series of checklists, and you then press the I accept the terms and conditions, which basically says we're going to be able to serve things up to you. So that's the way that we tend to do it. That is one of our current challenges, and the reason it's a big challenge for us is that going back to what I said about 60 million passengers a year coming through our airports, we don't actually know that they're coming to our airport until they actually arrive. And that is one of the key challenges. So what we're trying to do is get more joined up with airlines, some of the booking engines, to get more information about how can we know that people are coming well in advance so that we can then start to condition them, start to incentivize them, send offers to them. That's the sort of the approach that we're taking. I mean, I'm talking about some of the things that we're doing. I wouldn't say we're at the end of the journey. We're almost at the start of the journey because there is so much that can be achieved in this space. And it is challenging, it's complicated, and the world moves very, very quickly. So, we are developing these things, and we're seeing what the feedback is. There isn't such a thing out there as an airport kind of operating system that you can just go and buy and plug in. You have to develop these things, and all different airports have got different types of approaches. They've got different infrastructure, got different demographics of passengers. They've got different airlines operating with them, different stakeholders. So we're trying to plug all those things together based on what we know. We're trying to capture those passengers, and we're trying to create the loyalty so that we continue to be able to develop our business and sell those products and services.
Andrew, as a follow-on question, much like Uber Eats, you've got multiple stakeholders here. You've not just got passengers, but you have airlines. Have you been at this long enough to get a perspective on how the airlines are seeing some of the efforts you're making here?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And we've got 80 airlines based at Manchester, 80 different airlines, and we fly to 220 different destinations. Airlines are going through the same, kind of learning process. I would describe airlines now as IT companies with booking engines, with pieces of metal that they fly around the world, because that's how they make money from trading, they make money from an elastic market, they make money from ancillary services, products and services, they make money from yield management, they make money from how they trade fuel. The aircraft itself is a relatively straightforward part of their
Right.
business model.
Right.
It's the rest of the digital revolution which is really driving and disrupting their world. So I think we're trying to work with them, but it is complicated when you've got 80 different airlines to deal with.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, other questions, please, in the front.
Yeah, hi, this is Ankur. I just wanted to ask, in the perfect future, people wouldn't be waiting at airports. So how will you be relevant?
Yeah, and I think, you know, for us, we're a business. We're there to make money. We've got very expensive infrastructure. Right now, we've got a project going on where we're spending £1 billion on expanding our facilities. So if we can get to a point where we get the passenger experience as frictionless as it possibly can be, you know, in a world of things like security and immigration, you know, that's quite challenging. But what we want to be able to do is have a relationship with the passenger, as I've said, which is pre-journey and post-journey. And if we can develop revenue streams from that part of the process, then it's not as important that we've got a captive audience there for 2 hours in the airport when they're spending money in things like food and beverage outlets or shops or things like that. I think the other thing that we're starting to look at as well, and I should have mentioned this, is that, you know, if you think about electric vehicles, autonomous vehicles, driverless cars, etc., you know, that's another big factor for us that we're starting to think about for the future. And we're at the early stages of that. Electric vehicles are here, and they're here to stay. Autonomous vehicles are coming, and we know that they're coming. It's a big part of our business. We've got 50,000 car parking spaces at Manchester Airport. So it's a big chunk of our revenue stream. So again, we're having to think about that and how we make that more frictionless. And it could be that things like, you know, Uber, you know, the kind of drop-off stuff, we've got to think about how do we augment that into the end-to-end passenger journey in a different way than we're doing at the moment.
Great. Other questions? Okay, one more question? Well, I've got one, Prabhat, for you. And this comes down to when you think about different business models and programs, and you're looking ahead to how your business will continue to change in the future, how do you continue to drive customer value creation? Are you thinking about new and different programs as you look ahead?
Yeah, we are. So there's one, and there's one part which is our classifieds business, which continues to grow, and that's essentially bread and butter. But I spoke about our ventures unit. That is a dedicated, carved-out unit that looks into newer business models, and essentially they follow a very classic approach where they do a MVP or they buy a small company in a geography, essentially take learnings from that and then replicate it across our other businesses. And that's a very systematic process that we follow. So essentially across, say, our goods categories, across cars categories, across jobs, across real estate, we look at innovative business models across the globe that resonate with classifieds, help us leverage some competitive, some advantage that we have from that business, whether it's customer acquisition, whether it's essentially building adjacencies, and then the replication process starts. After that business is somewhat mature, we've taken learnings, or the business model is dropped. I mean, if we don't see it adding value, but that's the way we look at it as a group.
Yeah, thank you. So it's interesting, isn't it? We opened up the session this evening with Steve talking about some of the themes that have come out of his recent book, and some of the innovative themes and the changes in business models that we're seeing. We heard a terrific story of the growth story from Raj about what's happening with Uber Eats, particularly here in Asia, with a real keen focus on customer needs, today's customer needs and tomorrow's customer needs. You've heard from our two clients this evening about their changing business models. If we were having this discussion even 3 years ago, it'd be a dramatically different discussion. And the change curve in your business and in your new business is moving so quickly. It just takes a little imagination, Steve, doesn't it, to think about what these business models are going to look like just a couple of years from now. But with that as a close, I'd like for you to give a big round of applause to our panelists. Thank you very much. It's been a privilege to be here with you both.
Tim, we do have some token of appreciation that you can hand out.
You might be surprised what book this might be, right? Mr. Prabhat, thank you very much. Really enjoyed you being with us. Andrew, thanks very much for being with us. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. So remove these. Keep going. I really appreciate you all. We realize we're running a bit late. Just appreciate your indulgence and patience for one last session. But before I do that, I did want to announce, talk about one initiative, customer centricity being a core theme for today. As a lead up to today, we went to some of our top universities, business schools and engineering schools, and asked the customers of tomorrow how they thought about design thinking and the application of design thinking. And we did get some fascinating responses. So I would love to announce 3 winners. Get the next slide on. We have 2 from MDI in Gurgaon and 1 from XLRI in Jamshedpur. So maybe a round of applause for them. Yeah? Great. 1 more. I think if you are interested in knowing what their responses were, I think we can go online and get some more information. Unfortunately, we don't have too much time for today. But on to our last session. I would love to invite Rajiv Singh, who is our auto sector leader for Deloitte in India. Rajiv.
Yes, good evening. Good evening. Yeah, thank you. That's better. I know this is the last session, and I know that it's going to be a tough session because we are going to be standing between you and the drinks and the dinner. But to make it more interesting, let me invite our guest out here. Let me invite Mr. Ashok Bhasin. Yes, Ashok, please. So Ashok is head digitization for the largest two-wheeler company, Hero MotoCorp. And as we kind of discussed over the next 20 minutes, we are going to try and touch upon some of the points that we have been listening or talking for the last 2 hours. To begin with, Ashok, let me directly get into trying to understand from you that we did hear that the consumer of today is changing. The consumer that we face today is very different from the consumer that we had about, say, 5 years back or 10 years back. And it was interesting to hear Raj, who spoke about how he's changing the behavior of the consumer itself. Now, with this change in behavior of the consumer that you see, how is it that you're trying to address this changing need? And do you see any new business models evolving at your organization or in your industry with this change in the customer's experiences?
Thank you, Rajiv. Well, for sure. I mean, I think I can't add much value to the fact that the consumer is changing, and probably from the time that the conference began today and the time I go back to work tomorrow morning, there would be changes, for sure. I think everything that we heard from Stephen and Raj and others, I think, alludes to very definitive evidence that the change is taking place. The first thing I want to say is that I think the change that is taking place externally, which is the external world, which is the world of the consumer, I think for most organizations, if I may be straight and blunt, will be much, much faster than the rate of change that is internally taking place in any organization, including mobility, automotive, and even the largest companies. So I think the first thing is that if the consumer is changing at a pace of 10x, 100x, what are organizations going to do to drive internal change? The second is that there are consumers coming today more and more who are moving from the product mode to solutions and services. So if Uber is going to do it or somebody else is going to do it, public transport is going to do it, smart cities are going to come, people are not going to travel to work. If food is going to get delivered and people don't have to travel to food, what does it mean? So I think particularly in the mobility space, companies will have to think of the end game, which is about consumption of the service, which is about mobility. What's the new need going to be? What's the new consumption pattern going to be? Ownership may or may not be with individuals. It will be, in some cases, individuals. Fleets will play a role, and new modes of transportation will come into play. In terms of product form and function, I think there's a reference to electric, hybrid, alternate, etc., the autonomous, connected electric shared vehicles. what it fundamentally will mean is that already there are dealers who are talking about what will happen to our revenue model. There's already a prime issue, just like the restaurant business, in the automobile business, where the cost of real estate to sell, to merchandise, and also servicing, which is very important, which takes a lot of space. And just because it is important to be environment friendly, I think it has significant implications because your service workshops have to be at a certain place in a certain way. The economic model on those two primary parameters is under acute pressure in the industry. And I would say that. Obviously, some companies are doing a better job of that. What I think it means is that automotive players, to map to this new consumer journey, who is now available to be reached digitally for communicating, for influencing brand choice, for setting up service, frequency may come down with electric. The way I summarize all of that is the theme and the concept of narrow casting. I think most of us sitting in the room, not all, I can see several younger faces. I certainly grew up in the age of broadcasting. How can you reach more people faster, bigger, more scale? In India, we sell 2 million two-wheelers every month, we meaning as an industry. And I pick up two-wheelers because it's a bigger, more sexier number. Passenger vehicles will only be 3. So if 2 million are selling, and we know the average conversion rate is 25 to 30%, we also know that the average search phase for a consumer is about 3 months. In the most liberal definition, it is 6 months. What does that mean? If to sell to 2 million, you have to talk to 6 million, why are mega bucks getting spent on broadcasting, advertising, on expensive properties like YouTube masthead and massive star sports and IPL spots? I think it's a question in value chain that automotive players will have to think. The second is, from a service standpoint, I think the consumer, the two-wheeler consumer, certainly in many cases, is about personal mobility and goods. What we can do to re-engineer our service reach and service delivery, the time that they can deliver so that there is less idle time for them. Can we pick up the vehicles instead of they coming to the workshop? We've already done some pilots where we are looking at, not looking at, but actually implementing mobile service vans. And I can tell you, we have a program called Service Har Jagah. It actually makes more economic sense to load all your parts and a few technicians and to go and put a camp out there 90, 100, 140 kilometers out of the city. The economic model of that is better because the customer doesn't spend time, because 50% of our customers in rural markets, right? While we have the widest, deepest, best penetrated service network at 6,000 touch points and 50,000 mechanics, but I still think it is less than what the consumer needs, because he or she does not want to spend time. They lose a whole day. They come, they leave the bike, and then they have to go to do some local shopping. So I think new service models, new delivery models, new fleet ownership versus consumption models, narrow costing of all of that. Another provocative thing that I think is an opportunity, and again I go back to the consumer, because the new consumer is looking for faster, better, cheaper. The automotive industry on an average works at a finished goods inventory of about 6 weeks. I can't imagine if the leads cannot be tracked better, and we're already doing some pilots. If the leads cannot be better tracked, the configuration cannot be better identified. Not to have this 6 weeks of capital on which all of us together as an industry are creating a huge opportunity and an economic value creation, not in our sector, but perhaps for the banking and the NBFC industry. The consumer experience today is not homogeneous and not integrated. There is product, which is the sale part. There is the service, and even with the companies with the best network and best service like Hero MotoCorp, there is an attrition rate of service. Eventually, the consumer does not come back to your workshop. He or she goes to, the local mechanics. That value capture is one issue. The second is the consumer experience is not going to be as consistent, as integrated. At the time of purchase itself, there is finance and there is insurance and there is pre-owned vehicle and there is a trade-in opportunity. Of course, there are several people who are trying that. I think there are immense opportunities to integrate several of these things. We have so many pilots going on, so I can go on, but I think the key thing is solutions and service, narrow casting, and getting more efficient.
No, that's brilliant. I was just trying to gauge over it. You said that moving away from broadcasting to narrow casting, that's what probably one of the actions could be. And you also spoke about how narrowcasting is not going to be only from a consumer perspective, but in so many other facets which impact. The most important thing, as you were speaking, I was feeling is that you're saying 4 to 6 weeks of inventory if people are carrying. And if I just look at the entire automotive industry, probably $30 billion of sales and 4 to 6 billion or whatever, 4 to 6 weeks of inventory getting released is significant amount of value release which is possible. Coming to the next thing that was...
Just on the inventory piece, it's not just the working capital. Yeah. There is a direct impact of maintenance, there is a direct impact of the real estate, there is a direct impact of the yard, and there is a direct impact of product damage, obsolescence, and I can go on and on and on. I think there is a lot of collateral cost. So we got to think of creating that, kicking that waste out, getting the efficiency up, serving you, him, her, as a consumer much better, and then, of course,
And always we thought that probably this is the industry which is most efficient.
Even if it is, it can be made so much better is all I'm saying.
Yeah. Coming to, we heard a lot about convergence as well, and we do see a lot of convergence in a variety of things around us. So, request if you could share some thoughts on how do you see convergence impacting your sector, especially with the disruption which is happening on the technology side as well, and so many different stakeholders that you have who have a role to play in this sector. So what kind of convergence are you seeing really happening?
I think it's at multiple levels. I will just pick up a couple of examples which will be sort of more axiomatically obvious. One is in the product design, development, collaboration opportunity. Let's just think broader automotive and not just two-wheelers. Conventionally, there would be an engine, there would be a drivetrain, and there would be a cabin and bodybuilding, and that would be a car. And that is how the science went of automotive, from the horse to the car. And then came, things like infotainment and air conditioning and acoustics and all of that stuff. But today, when you sit in an electric vehicle, whether it's the new age electric two-wheelers that are getting developed and designed and tested in the market, or, an e-car, you're spoiled for space. There's virtually no need for, when I opened the Tesla for the first time, not that I own one, I said, man, there's so much of space here, so maybe the car will become smaller, maybe you'll do a double tasking of carrying goods, etc. So I think the convergence is going to come from completely different streams, whom we may not have 10, 20, 50 years ago thought of collaborating with. So it will be absolutely critical from an industry resource standpoint, from an innovation standpoint, and certainly from a consumer standpoint. He or she is looking to the best solution. And I think the collaboration and the convergence will first come in tech, certainly in product design. I think there is a huge opportunity in material science, because the new vehicles, if they're designed differently, if they have to run differently, do we need the same level of aluminum and steel? And, with all the pricing thing that is happening today. So I think the weight of the machines, I think there is a huge stuff there. I think the telecom and the communication companies will have an absolutely important role to play, whether it is the connectivity of the vehicle, whether it is the information, whether it is the hyper-local information that I think there'll be a competition. Uber will be thinking that they know the ride and the food sharing pattern, and I will say, I know exactly where my bike and the consumer goes, where often, how, where do they stop, which traffic light, what calls do they make, and what food do they stop for, etc., etc. So I don't know where the world will meet. For sure, apart from the drones, they will still need two-wheelers. But I think all of those are convergence opportunities. To say that one can crystal ball gaze and precisely predict what that convergence would be, I think would be wrong. But I can for sure say that these 4 key elements, which is product design and manufacturing of core auto, the electric piece, which is the tech piece, which is the digital piece, the telematics and the telecom piece, and some of the solution and service piece. And I think underlying all of this is the whole finance and insurance. There doesn't have to be one shoe fitting all. Insurance can certainly be customized based on onboard diagnostics and all of the stuff that is going to be possible with the new age vehicles, including two-wheelers. We've just seen what has happened in the industry in the last few months. The cost of insurance has gone up. I don't think it's a bad idea to have insurance. I don't think it's a bad idea to push for the right value of insurance. But we do know that pill has been a very difficult one for the consumer to consume. So how can all of this be optimized so that it's not about one blanket decision that everybody has to pay 5,000-7,000 rupees more, and the whole industry is then facing trouble. So I think convergence of all of this, it's got to get integrated, and converging the whole cycle of actual solution and service, not just the product sale. And how will we use the dealer's real estate, and we do the showrooms have to have that back. I think if the convergence takes place, then there is a return on that. Otherwise, some of the economic models will completely change.
Yeah, good, interesting. So that means that new business models will keep evolving with this convergence happening. Coming to, we did experience some of the startups in the other room when we went on the other side, and we did speak before the session. The two of us were talking about startups and how Israel has taken a lead and what is happening to startups ecosystem here in India. We do believe that these startups are extremely important from an innovation perspective, and startups also take a lot of risk. They show a lot of flexibility in terms of trying out different business models, finding out which business model fits the best, and then there is one business model which we think is sustainable and scalable, and that's how it goes ahead. Now, I know I'm not going to get into anything which is confidential from a Hero Motor perspective, but what do you think is this ecosystem evolving, where we find a lot of automotive players like you talking to various kinds of startups, trying to build some kind of an ecosystem, evolve some new business models, and try to answer the convergence which is happening. Any thoughts around this?
Well, I think we would miss an opportunity if we didn't do that. So I think as a corporation, we've certainly accelerated our engagement, and it is not just at a conversation stage. I think we're putting our money where our mouth is in terms of resources, in terms of some of the future R&D projects with institutions, with researchers who are not typically in our industry. And certainly there are some investments that are known in the public space that we have made, and there are several others that the group has made, not the motor corp, but the group at a promoter level, family office of live. It's because we genuinely believe that if we don't proactively accelerate some of these conversations, engagements, and experiments, startups by their very nature are actually sort of what I would say ready-made MVP opportunities. So every startup, including the startups and auto portal companies, etc., today one of the leading passenger vehicle companies saying they want to create their own portal. The startup is an MVP opportunity for me. So somebody who's doing an e-vehicle, somebody who's doing a ride sharing, somebody who's doing a dockless or docking, all of those are opportunities for us, including people in places like Israel who are doing fantastic stuff in telematics and future innovation, etc. So yeah, we are, I think, not just having conversations. We are investing our resources. We are spending our time. We have some projects and pilots going on. Obviously, I can't speak to them, which are a unique combination of what we know, and we recognize that there is a lot that we don't know, and we have to collaborate. So we are committed to that, and I think if we do it faster, better, cheaper, bigger, or at least more than some of our competitors, it will make sure that we continue to stay in the leading position that we have fortunately been as world's largest two-wheeler company for 17 years in a row, and we absolutely have no intentions to let that go at any cost. And that would need innovation, and that would need convergence.
Yeah, and that would also probably need an ecosystem along with some of the startups.
Absolutely,
yes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
More than ever before.
Exactly. I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the time, and I was warned before I came here that don't extend your session beyond 20 minutes. So I'm going to hold back some of the questions maybe which will continue over the drinks and dinner. But let me open up to the audience out here. Any questions that you may have to Mr. Ashok? Yeah? Time up? Okay. So he is indicating to me it's really time. One question maybe.
Sorry, I'm a lawyer, so I keep on asking questions, and pardon me for that. How are you planning to integrate IoT into your product? Because, there have been new models that have come out with convergence of IoT with the business model into the tractors and stuff like that. So you have any thoughts on that or at this point in time? Or
I think it would work at multiple levels. It would work at levels of routing and traffic management, and it would work at the level of navigation for the consumer. It would work at the level of safety. It would work at the level of service onboard diagnostics. It would work at the level of using that to connect to other elements in the network of the consumer's life. It could be other vehicles, family, food consumption, hospitals, safety. So it can be in many, many areas. We are obviously doing pilots in many, but I think road safety is one critical area where it absolutely is a sure shot application. Traffic management is the second, and onboard diagnostics of the bike based on the road conditions and weather conditions is certainly a third big one, and several others that I can talk. But I think these three for sure seem like clear opportunities. And
so I hope to get my two-wheeler free, and you will.
The new business models will emerge, but I think fair to say that if there is value for the consumer, it will be done in a manner that there is a value creation for the stakeholders. But because there will be intelligent collaboration, I think there is a great likelihood that it will be a win-win, and only then it will be a sustainable model.
Thank you so much.
But I'm optimistic, Mr. Desai. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. In the interest of time, let me probably, Kumar, request you to.
Ladies and gentlemen, all the good things have to come to a close today with this wonderful conversation. Why don't we wrap things up? When we started this idea of creating a platform for conversations around convergence 3 years ago, it seemed to be a world of haves and have-nots, the disrupted and the disruptors. Much has changed in the last 2-3 years that we have had 3 of these events, and we have constantly been in touch with our clients through our convergence page. But every passing day, we seem to come up with new ideas, new possibilities, new technologies that create these possibilities. So, we will continue this initiative of bringing to you new ideas, not just episodically once in a year when we will certainly have these events, but whenever you have time, please look up our convergence page where we will be bringing new thoughts, and this is obviously very important to a lot of people. As you can see on the screen, we have had almost 600,000 people who have looked at this, and several of them have been engaged with us. So please do look this up. And we have been very fortunate to have had a number of our clients who have contributed to content. They have done interviews very happily. Many of these are going to be uploaded in the days and weeks to come. Before we close, I have a very pleasant task of thanking several people. First of all, the speakers who came by, Steve, Raj, Andrew, Prabhat, and Ashok. You guys have really bad calendars for you to have come here, spend time. Steve and Raj traveling across continents to be here is something that we really appreciate. Audience here, Delhi traffic, spending 3 hours is not easy. So thank you so much for being here and being such an inquisitive audience. And we have on online well over a couple of thousand people who have watched this event live. Some of them have posted questions. So thank you guys for being there. And the students of these 8 or 9 institutes that participated in the contest that we ran, thank you guys, and look forward to working with you at some stage. And lastly, the young entrepreneurs who displayed their ideas in the room next to this, thank you for being such sports and being here with us right through the day, demoing your ideas repeatedly to several people. So with that, why don't I close and invite you to join us for drinks in the next room. And you'll also have a chance to look at those startup ideas that are continue to be displayed. And after that, we'll come back here for dinner. Thank you again, ladies and gentlemen. A round of applause.